We've got an election coming up that people are honestly terrified about. Got racist police killings continuing, and the protests against them continue as well. We got right-wing nationalists showing up at protests to assault people and kill them who oppose police violence, and Trump-supporting cult members are showing up at some early voting polling places to intimidate voters. Now, I know it's hard to tell the difference between those two groups, so I'll admit that in some cases, those are actually the same people. A new justice with the least amount of experience ever was just speed appointed to the Supreme Court, solidifying a conservative majority on the court for at least a few decades. And guess what, y'all? If that wasn't enough to stoke your anxiety right now, coronavirus is still a thing. So much so that Dr. Anthony Fauci said for the first time since the coronavirus pandemic spread in the U.S. that he supports a national mask mandate to stop the spread of the virus that's just having its way across the U.S. And he said he regretted that masks weren't more widely adopted across the country. The continued spread of the virus is so bad that Dr. Thomas Dobbs, state health officer of Mississippi, admitted in public during the day on live TV that it is maskless white people spreading the virus now. Quote, as far as the case trends, we have had really good uptake by a lot of folks in the Black community with masking and social distancing. And I'll just say, I think big parts of the white community, especially in areas that maybe weren't as hard affected previously, have not been as compliant or engaged actively with social distancing and masking. And I think that does make a difference. End quote. He said that. And I'm surprised he actually said it because, Mississippi. But if we understood how completely unreasonably uncooperative some people in this country have always been in a crisis, even a national one that threatens people's lives, none of this would have surprised anyone. Now, of course, we've got the pandemic. And back in 1918, the Spanish flu showed up in Kansas, then spread in the United States. Now, it's reported that the U.S. outbreak was the second wave of that flu, with military members carrying the virus as they returned from World War I. There was no national plan to combat the virus then. State and local officials were under pressure, though, to keep up a patriotic and positive outlook, so the danger of the virus was downplayed in the U.S. media, likening the virus to the regular old flu. And of course, this proved disastrous in densely packed cities like Philadelphia, where a parade attended by tens of thousands of city residents resulted in 1,000 people dead of the Spanish flu and 200,000 sick from the virus 10 days later. Over the next 6 months, 15,000 Philadelphians died of the flu due to the city's lax response to it. Other cities took the lessons of cities like Philadelphia seriously and were more vigilant and suffered fewer fatalities. And I'm always amused at the pictures from that time of how seriously some people finally took wearing masks. They even put masks on their pets, on their little cats and dogs, but not until tens of thousands of people died from ignoring that one simple action of wearing a mask. And you think that facing a global pandemic that's taken the lives of over 200,000 Americans would be a disaster big enough to bring people together in that syrupy social media meme way that people are so convinced is real life in this country. But real life is actually the way that even during the Spanish flu a century ago, white people were still carrying out acts of racist terrorism against Black people and communities. Right in Philadelphia, during the spread of the virus in 1918, the Philadelphia race riot occurred. In the next year, as the virus spread across the country, so did the race massacres in Charleston, South Carolina, Longview, Texas, Washington, D.C., Chicago, Illinois, Knoxville, Tennessee, and Elaine, Arkansas. This was, of course, the Red Summer of 1919, named such because of the blood spilled on the streets of so many U.S. cities by racist white mobs, Black blood, usually made up of white servicemen and other white citizens angry that Black servicemen came back from World War I, believing that they had rights just because they fought for the freedom of other people across the world. while people did not want their country here to change from the status quo of Jim Crow, and those uppity Black servicemen coming back with their guns and their pride were seen as a threat to their comfortable caste system that they built after slavery ended and Reconstruction was destroyed. So white people continued to commit acts of mob violence and racist terrorism on Black people and communities, as well as on Latinx people and communities and others long after 1919. But the spread of a deadly pandemic didn't even stop them from hating us. Remember that when you wonder how anybody could be so angry that they'd show up at a polling place today with guns to intimidate people. And then, of course, we have an election that for many is the most important election of the entire country's history, and certainly for some people's lifetime. Well, the election of 1920 was no less pivotal since the country was just coming out of World War I, and people were not happy that Democratic President Woodrow Wilson, who'd had a stroke and was practically in seclusion in 1919, didn't keep the country out of World War I as he promised in his campaign, didn't involve Congress in negotiating the Treaty of Versailles, which, remember, would lead to the rise of Adolf Hitler, the Nazi Party, and World War II. In later years, but nobody could know that then. But people did know that that treaty made both parties angry, and Wilson's brutal repression of workers as he directed federal troops to break up several major labor strikes, and he even mass deported suspected radicals, really made that man incredibly unpopular. Yes, Wilson was a virulent racist, but most people didn't really care much about that because honestly, most if not all presidents were racist. Some were just more polite about it. And we already talked about the racial issues within the country. The Democrats lost the White House in the 1920 election, and Republican Warren Harding was the next president. Now, of course, we can't look at these historic events and make completely linear comparisons and predict what will happen in this election. That's not even my point. What I'm trying to say is that we need to stop telling ourselves this lie that we're all Americans and we always come together and support each other, and that it is ever any politician that divides us. We've done a very good job of dividing ourselves all by ourselves. Maybe taking an unflinching look at history will help us to do better on the other side of whatever this pandemic, the racial uprising, and the outcome of this election brings. Follow Luqman Nation on patreon.com/LuqmanNation for lots of great content.